The last thing I expected on the morning a 48-year-old database architect, was about to pitch a $75 million solution was to be publicly shamed for my pants. "You will need to go home and change, Gary. Jeans are not appropriate for this office," Richard Vance declared, his voice soaked in smugness, one palm resting dramatically on the company handbook like he was about to swear me into corporate purgatory. Never mind that they were dark wash, pressed, and frankly nicer than the wrinkled khakis he wore every single day. No, this was not about denim. This was about control. It was a well-timed corporate kick to the ribs right before I presented the database module I had spent the last 6 months perfecting. I stood there clutching my tablet, my code glowing on the screen like a loaded weapon I was not allowed to use. The conference room door closed behind me with the finality of a guillotine. I did not argue. I simply smiled, nodded, and walked down the sterile gray hallway of Summit Solutions like a condemned man already planning his jailbreak. I did not go home. Instead, I walked straight past the elevator and out into the hot, humid air of an Ohio July. I took a hard left toward a quiet coffee shop down the street, sat in my usual booth, and sent Nora Kelly a message with just one word: "Go time." She replied immediately with a graphic of a rocket launch, then called me on video. Her face was a picture of excited chaos as she asked if we were really doing this now. I told her yes, effective immediately. We logged into the secure repository we had been building on nights and weekends. It was always risky with our non-disclosure agreements, but it was ours. Every line of code, every design sketch, and every bug we had resolved with Midnight Energy drinks was sitting in the cloud, waiting to come alive. I registered Aura Connect LLC on my phone while waiting for my coffee. I transferred the final iteration of the prototype to our private servers and scheduled a remote wipe of my company-issued laptop for midnight. Then I wrote a cold, professional resignation letter. I set it to send automatically at 11 minutes after 10 in the morning, which was exactly 11 minutes into the meeting I was supposed to lead. The subject line was simply standard deviation. When Nora saw it, she laughed and said she loved how petty it was. I was halfway through wiring our freelance designer his advance payment when my personal inbox pinged with a name I had not seen in over a year. It was Jeffrey Cole, a venture capitalist who used to be my boss. His subject line asked if I was still building something world-changing, and he attached an invitation for coffee the following week. I had not replied to his previous messages, but this time I did not hesitate to accept. Then, because corporate pettiness is an ecosystem all its own, I checked the Summit Solutions messaging channels. I saw that Vance had already posted the project update. He had used my slide deck and my diagrams, but he had put his own initials in the file name. He posted a comment saying that we have standards. I smiled to myself. I had a standard now too, and it was a standard for revenge. By noon, I had finished my 4th espresso and was sitting in our tiny workspace. Nora was already sending me links to low-rent co-working spaces and asking if we could afford sticky notes. I told her we would have to pick one and barter for the other. The resignation email hit Vance's inbox on schedule. It was time-stamped, legally solid, and carbon-copied to Human Resources, the legal department, and one intern who had once brought me a sandwich. There was no immediate response from Vance, just a direct message from a former colleague named Aaron. He asked if I had really resigned in the middle of the pitch. I told him yes, I did. Nora and I had talked about starting Aura Connect for 3 years, but it was always in a fantasy way. Now it was no longer hypothetical. We opened our development vault and made it real. The repository changed to Aura Connect Production. I transferred the database structure, encrypted our development notes, and stripped every piece of metadata that might point back to Summit Solutions. Our work had officially moved out of the background, and that was when the reality of it all hit me. I had no salary, no benefits, and no tech support team to blame if the servers crashed. It was just me, a senior developer, and Nora, a designer with a serious caffeine habit, holding a business certificate we had just downloaded. I stared at the venture capitalist invite from Jeffrey Cole. I had avoided responding because I assumed it would lead to disappointment, like every other time I had put myself out there with an early idea. But now, I did not care. I clicked accept and chose the earliest slot. I did not need money yet. I needed access, information, and connections. If Jeffrey could get me a short meeting with someone at Nexus Systems, I would figure out the rest. We built a task board with 53 items, 21 of which involved convincing people to help us without immediate pay. I messaged our designer, Julian, who owed me a favor. I promised him 5% equity in the business. He agreed immediately, asking how soon we needed the designs. I told him we needed them yesterday. The reality was like a freight train of adrenaline running down an unstable track, but we were finally moving. The transition from a high-rise office to a cramped garage was a cold shower for my ego. Nora's garage smelled of old lawnmowers, dust, and burnt cheese. We had power cords running across the concrete floor like thick vines, a whiteboard propped against a rusty lawn chair, and a single fan that did nothing but move the hot Ohio air around. We were starting from absolute zero, but there was a strange, raw freedom in it. There were no project managers asking for daily status reports, no human resources representatives checking on our dress code, and no Richard Vance taking credit for our work. It was just the code and us. We had set up 2 second-hand monitors on a folding table, and my back was already aching from sitting on a wooden stool, but the adrenaline kept us focused. On Tuesday morning, I walked into a quiet coffee shop called Pressed and Pour to meet Jeffrey Cole. He looked exactly the same as he did when I worked under him at my previous job, wearing a designer fleece vest and holding a reusable cup like a brand ambassador. He gave me a quick scan as I sat down, his eyes lingering on my dark jeans. He smirked and remarked that he did not think I would actually show up after my sudden, noisy departure from Summit Solutions. I told him that when a manager tries to bury you over a dress code violation, you tend to find motivation quickly. We did the usual corporate small talk. He mentioned his venture firm's latest funding round, and I listened patiently, waiting for him to ask for a pitch. I did not give him one. I told him flatly that I was not there to ask for money. I needed a name, specifically someone inside Nexus Systems who could get our product in front of Diana Reed, the executive vice president who was overseeing their $75 million technology upgrade. Jeffrey leaned back, looking surprised. He told me that Nexus Systems was already deeply committed to Summit Solutions. I pointed out that they were only committed because they had not seen an alternative. I explained that Summit Solutions was going to present a bloated, slow system that did not actually address their core database issues. I opened my tablet and showed him our initial database interface. It was fast, clean, and responsive. He studied the screen, and I could see the skepticism in his eyes turn into genuine interest. He noted that we were not just competing on features, but on absolute speed. Jeffrey then leaned in and told me something off the record. He had lunch with Diana Reed 2 weeks ago, and she was furious with the current state of enterprise software. She was tired of vendors presenting polished slideshows instead of working products. He quoted her saying, she wanted someone to show her a solution that actually solved the database bottleneck, without the corporate jargon and endless presentations. He told me she had highlighted a specific database segmentation issue that no one had been able to resolve. The problem involved high-latency indexing on distributed nodes, which caused a major delay when generating real-time analytics for millions of active users. She had even brought it up at an industry panel last quarter and received nothing but blank stares from several tech executives who only knew how to sell slides. My mind immediately went back to that panel. I had been sitting in the back row of that conference hall, taking detailed notes, while Richard Vance had doodled on his notepad and whispered to me that the issue was too niche to matter. Vance had argued that the client would never notice a 3-second lag, but Diana Reed's business relied on real-time transaction processing, and a 3-second delay was an eternity. I had spent my evenings over the next month sketching out a custom database workaround for that exact indexing problem, because I actually cared about the engineering. Jeffrey told me that Diana Reed hated formal proposals. He suggested that if we could show her a working prototype that solved that specific database bottleneck, we might just bypass the entire bidding process. I did not even finish my coffee. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out with a clear target in my mind. I messaged Nora immediately, telling her that we were no longer building a general database tool. We were building a custom solution, specifically for Diana Reed. She replied with an enthusiastic message. The strategy had shifted. While Summit Solutions spent the next 2 weeks printing thick binders and practicing buzzwords, we were going to build something that actually worked. We had less than 2 weeks to deliver a working system that would make their $75 million bid look like ancient history. It was a massive gamble. But it was the only way to win. Our workspace became a pressure cooker of caffeine and code. For 7 days, Nora and I lived on microwave meals and energy drinks. We were not just building a database tool. We were handcrafting a direct message to Summit Solutions in the form of software. Every development decision we made had to answer one question. Would this help Diana Reid solve her indexing problem immediately? To make the system truly impressive, we needed a flawless user interface. I contacted Julian, a talented designer based in Berlin who operated on late-night hours. We could not afford to pay him a salary, so I offered him 5% equity in Aura Connect and a promise of future work. Julian accepted without hesitation. Within 48 hours, he delivered a clean, responsive layout that made the application look incredibly polished. It was fast, modern, and designed specifically for the real-time monitoring that Diana Reid wanted. While we were testing the new interface, my personal email inbox pinged. It was an official message from the Human Resources Department at Summit Solutions. The letter stated that my abrupt departure during a client presentation, without providing transition documentation, was a breach of professional conduct and would be noted in my permanent employment file. I stared at the screen and laughed. I used the printed email as a coaster for my coffee cup and went back to work. I did not need their approval. I was building my own future. We spent the next 3 days refining the data pipeline. Nora focused on security protocols while I worked on the indexing logic. Because we were building a business that would compete with our former employer, we had to be legally meticulous. I ran our entire repository through an automated code audit tool to ensure that not a single line of Summit Solutions' proprietary code was present in our product. We had developed the core data routing algorithm on my personal computer during weekends, long before Summit Solutions had even conceived their current project. Under our employment contracts, any work created on personal time, using personal equipment, and without company resources belonged entirely to us. We had documented every commit, every timestamp, and every server log to prove it. We slept in 2-hour bursts on a couple of old sleeping bags on the concrete floor. My hands were stiff and my eyes were bloodshot, but the system was performing better than I had ever hoped. We could process millions of database queries with zero latency. On Friday afternoon, I received a text from Chloe, a software tester who still worked at Summit Solutions. She told me that Richard Vance had conducted an internal dry run of their database solution, and it had crashed 3 times in front of the department heads. Vance had apparently lost his temper and blamed the development team for the failure, claiming they had sabotaged the system after my resignation. Chloe also mentioned that the management was in a panic because their final pitch to Nexus Systems was scheduled in just 2 weeks. Then she added an interesting piece of news. She had heard that a business publication was looking to write a feature story on independent technology startups, specifically focusing on founders who had left corporate jobs to build their own companies. The journalist coordinate was Peter Davis, a writer for Forbes who focused on tech sector stories. I read Chloe's message twice, then sat down at my laptop. This was the exact opening I had hoped to find. I did not just want to win the contract. I wanted to control the narrative. I found Peter Davis's contact information and drafted a short, direct pitch. I wrote that my name was Gary Miller, and that I had recently left a senior role at a major firm after a public dispute over a dress code violation. I explained that in less than 3 weeks, my partner and I had built a functioning database solution that solved a critical problem the industry giants had ignored. I told him we were about to go head-to-head with my former employer for a $75 million contract. I ended the email by stating that if he was interested in a story about grit and code, I could show him the working software the following week. Peter Davis replied 6 hours later, stating that the premise sounded like an excellent feature and asking to schedule an interview. The pieces were falling into place. Summit Solutions was struggling with a failing product and an angry management team, while we had a working prototype and the interest of a major business reporter. The stakes were incredibly high, but for the first time, I felt like we were the ones driving the momentum. We had a deadline, a story, and a working solution. I met Brian Foster at a quiet cafe downtown on Wednesday morning. The place was filled with the hum of espresso machines and the low chatter of business people. As a junior innovation strategist at Nexus Systems, Brian was the gatekeeper to Diana Reed's office. He arrived wearing a formal suit and a tired expression, clearly expecting another sales presentation. I did not waste time with slides. I placed my tablet on the wooden table and opened our live dashboard. I told him that this was our database system running live queries against a test database of 10 million records. Brian looked at the screen, then tapped the index button. The system returned the segmented database results in less than 50 milliseconds. He blinked, refreshed the page, and tried again. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and asked how we had managed to eliminate the indexing lag. I explained that while Summit Solutions was trying to adapt an outdated system, we had built a new indexing algorithm from scratch. He admitted that Summit Solutions had been trying to solve this specific lag for 3 months and had recently told them it was technically impossible to achieve under 1 second. He spent another 10 minutes tapping through the system, testing various queries, and looking increasingly impressed by the speed and fluidity of the interface. Brian took notes on his own tablet, his attitude changing from polite boredom to genuine excitement. He promised to show the live link to Diana Reed that afternoon, stating that she would want to see this immediately. I knew that if he could get her to open the link, the software would speak for itself. When I got back to the garage, Nora had a tense look on her face. She was holding a document that had just been delivered by a courier. It was a formal cease and desist letter from Summit Solutions' legal department. Nora read the key paragraphs aloud, her voice trembling slightly. The document claimed that Aura Connect was utilizing proprietary technology developed during my employment and threatened to sue us for breach of contract and theft of intellectual property. They demanded that we hand over our repository and cease all contact with Nexus Systems. We had prepared for this. I contacted our attorney, Matthew Pierce, who drafted a sharp response. We pointed out that under Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, I held the exclusive rights to the database, schemas, and architectural diagrams I had created outside the scope of my employment. We explained that the work-for-hire doctrine under Title 17, Section 201, subsection B of the United States Code did not apply here. I was employed as a database administrator, not a software developer, and the code was written entirely outside business hours on my personal computer. Additionally, because Richard Vance had copied my proprietary designs, rebranded them with his own initials, and distributed them to prospective clients, Summit Solutions was looking at a clear-cut case of copyright infringement and trade secret misappropriation under Title 18, Section 1836 of the United States Code. We attached evidence of Vance's plagiarized files, alongside my original timestamped files. We made it clear that if they filed a lawsuit, we would immediately countersue for copyright infringement and trade secret theft, and we would share the evidence with the press. We knew that Summit Solutions could not afford a public scandal right before their final pitch, and we never heard from their legal team again. On Thursday morning, I received an email from Diana Reed's assistant. The message confirmed that she had reviewed our live dashboard and wanted us to present a formal walkthrough of our software that afternoon. The assistant added a brief note at the end of the email, advising us to wear practical attire as Diana Reed appreciated efficiency and was tired of overdressed consultants who did not understand the technology. Nora looked at me and asked if I was going to wear my usual suit. I smiled and told her I was wearing my dark jeans and a simple blazer. They were the same pants that Richard Vance had claimed were inappropriate for a professional setting. They were the symbol of why I had left Summit Solutions. And they were the pants I would wear when I took their biggest client. We spent the remaining hours running final tests on the server nodes. Julian had optimized the rendering speed so that the dashboard loaded instantly. Nora verified the encryption keys. We were as ready as we could ever be. As we drove toward the Nexus Systems building, I looked at the city skyline and felt a deep sense of calm. We had survived the threats, we had built the technology, and now we had the opportunity to prove we were right. The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt like the final ascent of a roller coaster, where you can hear the click of the tracks and your own heartbeat. Nora gave my shoulder a brief squeeze as the doors slid open. She told me to remember to breathe. I smiled, feeling completely focused. We stepped into the glass and steel lobby of Nexus Systems, where the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a panoramic view of the Ohio skyline. The receptionist directed us to the main conference room, where Diana Reed was already waiting. She did not stand or smile, she simply nodded once, her eyes assessing us. Her team of managers sat along the table, holding tablets and looking skeptical. I did not use a slide deck. I connected my tablet to the main display and opened the live dashboard. I told them that this was not a proposal but a working solution. I walked them through the interface, showing how we resolved the database segmentation issue that had troubled them. I demonstrated how the system handled high-volume queries with zero latency. I showed them live data feeds, security encryption, and real-time reporting using a mock database of 1 million transaction records. One of the managers asked about security protocols, and Nora answered with technical precision, explaining our end-to-end encryption keys and role-based access controls. Another asked about scalability, and I explained how our indexing algorithm distributed the load across multiple nodes. Diana Reed watched the screen, then looked at me. She mentioned that Summit Solutions had presented their proposal the previous day, and their system had struggled to load the sample data, showing a high latency. She asked how our small team had managed to build a faster system than an established company. I told her that we did not waste time in meetings or writing status reports. We spent our time writing code. She asked who would be her primary contact if they signed the contract. I looked her in the eye and told her she was looking at him. She smiled slightly and said she appreciated a vendor who actually built the software instead of just talking about it. The meeting ended with a handshake. The following morning at 7:15, my phone pinged. I opened the email and saw a signed contract from Nexus Systems for $75 million. I stared at the document, feeling a wave of relief and pride. We had won the contract, and the future of Aura Connect was secure. The funding allowed us to hire Julian full-time and move out of the garage into a proper office space. A few hours later, I walked into the Forbes studio for my interview with Peter Davis. I wore my dark jeans and a casual button-down shirt. The photographer set up the shot in Nora's garage, next to our janky server rack, to capture the contrast of where the code was born. I sat there in my jeans, holding a laptop displaying the Aura Connect logo. I told Peter the entire story. Peter asked me if the jeans were the trigger for the startup. I told him that they were just the symbol. Corporate America has become obsessed with compliance and appearance rather than competence and engineering. They send people home for wearing denim while their managers steal work and crash systems. I told him that we wanted to build a company that focused on the code and the results, not the dress code. Lean startups are winning because they prioritize actual solutions over administrative theater. When the article was published 3 weeks later, my face was on the cover of the magazine. The headline read, "Dressed for Success." The subtitle explained how an independent startup had claimed a $75 million contract in less than a month. The story went viral on professional networks, shared by thousands of developers who were tired of corporate bureaucracy. That afternoon, I received a photo text from Chloe. The image showed Richard Vance standing in the break room at Summit Solutions, staring in disbelief at the cover of Forbes. His mouth was open and his tie was crooked. Chloe texted me that the management had canceled their scheduled meeting and that HR was pretending they could not read the news. I did not reply to the message. There was nothing left to say. The revenge was not about shouting or making threats. It was about showing up in the same pants I had been exiled for and proving that the people who tried to control me were wrong. I sat in our new office, which was bright, clean, and filled with the hum of our first server stack. Nora walked in and set a coffee cup on my desk. We did not throw a party or shout. We simply nodded to each other and went back to work. We were building something real, and the people who cared about dress codes could keep their empty meetings.